know which way the azimuth is.
And here we are at 2 o'clock.
No.
The mics are live and you're recording.
Okay, the microphones are on,
Okay.
and welcome to everyone. It's 2 o'clock. I'd like to call this meeting of the Rehoboth Beach Planning Commission to order. Will the secretary please call the roll?
Yes, Commissioner Dewey,
Present.
Commissioner Ellison,
Here.
Commissioner Gay,
Here.
Commissioner Hunter,
Here.
Commissioner Stewart,
Here.
Commissioner Stockdale,
Here.
Commissioner Strange. Here. Commissioner Davis, here. Commissioner Bryan, Chair Bryan.
We have a full house. Welcome. Ms. Womack, could we please have verification of the meeting notice?
The agenda was posted in City Hall and on the city portal on January 3rd of this year and was amended and reposted on January 12th. That's all I have, Chair.
Thank you. Any correspondence? All right. As far as the agenda items today, I would like to defer until February the continued discussion of recommendations to the Board of Commissioners concerning possible amendments to Chapter 236 of the City Code regarding site plan review. As a result of the comments that were received at the last meeting of this body, and as a result of continuing dialogue between the city solicitor, Mr. Mandalis, and our counsel, Mr. Mehta, I think things are moving in a positive direction, and I would like to see those discussions come to fruition and see if we can't work out whatever issues remain, and with the intent of deciding this at the February meeting. Does that seem fair, Mr. Mandalis? Okay. All right, so that matter will be deferred. Under old business, we will take up today, please, the consideration of and possible vote on proposed amendments to the Planning Commission's bylaws and rules of procedure. As to the bylaws, Mr. Mehta, I don't think there are any changes to what we've discussed before. Is that correct?
As to the bylaws, the Planning Commission members have seen this language for a while now, but as I pointed out the other day, this version differs, the bylaws differs from the prior version that was considered. By the way, this version incorporates any changes that were resulted from the December meeting, and in the version that I forwarded to the Planning Commission members, I noted that in Section 8 of the bylaws, there's a minor modification so that the first sentence would now read, as you can see on the screen, matters referred to the Planning Commission by the Board of Commissioners shall, if time is reasonably available, be placed on the calendar for consideration and action at the first regularly scheduled meeting of the Planning Commission after such referral.
So it's the phrase, I believe that I suggested that if time is reasonably available rather than if possible.
Correct. So that's the only modification. This is the language that you have seen. Unless there are any further questions, you may want to finally put this matter to a formal vote for final ratification so that the bylaws are approved. But I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Are there any questions by the members? Do I have a motion to approve the amendment to the bylaws?
I move.
We have a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Second, Ms. Stewart. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? The bylaws are amended. As to rules of procedure, Mr. Mehta, I think there's something that came up perhaps today that you have indicated may be of some consequence and we should consider.
Yeah, so with regard to the rules of procedure, that this body also has the power under the code to amend. Again, much of this language you have seen for many months now. This iteration, as you know, which I've circulated to you previously, incorporates changes since December. In addition, as I mentioned in my communication with all of you, in paragraph 4, I have deleted You do not see it here, but there was in a prior iteration of these rules. The first sentence was redundant and unnecessary, and so, as you know, I recommend we take that out. With regard to the paragraph 14, which is the sequencing provision of the rules, as I mentioned to you before, and as you know, this now contains a presumption of deferral by this body of conducting a preliminary review of or a public hearing or final action on a site plan for which a variance, rezoning, and/or other authorization under applicable federal, state, county, or city laws or regulations is required. That language comes straight out of the city code, by the way, until such time as the variance, rezoning, and/or other government authorization is obtained. A prior iteration of this sequencing rule contained an exhaustion of appeals clause, which is deleted and not contained in this iteration. In addition, with regard to the presumptive deferral of a preliminary review or a public hearing or final action on a site plan for which a variance, rezoning, and/or other authorization under applicable federal, state, county, or city laws and regulations is required, this proposal would give this body some discretion, if it wanted to, not obligated, to overcome that presumptive deferral, to give you a little bit of flexibility and wiggle room if you so choose. But I think it's important that there be factors that the rule clearly articulates that the body should look to in exercising that discretion. And so this proposal identifies certain factors, and there's one additional factor which I want to call out for you, which I've added this morning that you have not seen before. So the factors for overcoming presumptive deferral would be as follows. First, the amount of time the Planning Commission is expected to, so these would be factors for not deferring, for considering it, for not exercising, for not presumptively deferring site plan review at this stage anyway. These factors would be the amount of time the Planning Commission is expected to expend on a site plan that has not received requisite authorizations and approvals. Second, when the applicant reasonably expects to receive the requisite authorizations and approvals. Next, the extent of requisite authorizations and approvals. The next clause is the one I added today for your consideration. Whether the requisite authorizations and approvals could be made a condition of site plan approval. And then, as in the prior iteration, whether the applicant opposes deferral. My view is that this provides, it's a rational approach considering the time that this body would expend on a preliminary review or a public hearing or final action on a significant site plan review that would otherwise be subject to these other significant approvals. It presumptively defers that, but there are conditions upon which this body could, under this proposal, overcome that presumption and go ahead and move forward with site plan review under these factors.
Are there any questions of Mr. Mehta?
I wanted to make a few comments to make sure I understand exactly what's proposed and to be certain about its clarity. When I read this, I see that the decision to defer is one that presumptively favors deferment, but the exclusion is for compelling reasons. And on that point, I'm concerned that there may not be complete parallel construction between the first two sentences and the list of ensuing reasons. By that, I mean the phrase compelling reasons, to me, begs the question, compelling to who, number one. The second thing is that the phrase extent of requisite authorizations and approvals, to me, is unclear. I don't know if that refers to the number, the complexity, you know, what the word extent means. And then my third comment would be with respect to the phrase about the applicant opposing deferral. To me, that's almost a throwaway consideration. In other words, you know, I don't think you're really ever going to get into this process unless someone opposes deferral. So, you know, I'm suggesting a couple things for maybe further discussion if people have similar concerns. One, to make an adjustment so it is more clear that the among the factors the commission may consider in determining whether compelling considerations exist. Put that in right there. I don't like the phrase among, because among, from a statutory construction standpoint, you know, is a non-exclusive term. It means the ones identified plus more. So you've really built sort of an open-ended list of considerations. I'd like it to make it, I'm suggesting we should think about making it more clear what the exclusive factors are that should be considered in determining whether you have compelling considerations deferring or justifying deferment. And then possibly the other thing is, you guys are the experts here. I'm a newcomer to the commission, but it strikes me that, you know, when you look at what would be a compelling justification, you know, my mind goes to things like extreme hardship to someone, you know, whether it's financial hardship, you know, because something isn't going to take long, but if the approval is not obtained or if these things are not thought about early on, there's some dire consequence that attaches. So I threw out an awful lot here, maybe unfairly, but I think everyone's moving in the right direction. I've been trying to follow this, and I approve of how we've been eating this apple one bite at a time, but I'm still troubled by where we are right now. Thank you.
Well, these are your rules. The benefit of this technology is, and there's no current motion, so I can make changes here on the fly, and we've been at this for a while. You may want to leave today with having your rules amended and finalized today. I'm happy to make changes as part of a discussion today so we can get to a point for approval now. I think, again, the points that you raise are good, and I'm happy, again, these are your rules, and I'm happy to craft language to help you achieve. The purpose here, though, really is to strike a balance and to give this body some discretion to overcome a presumptive deferral under these circumstances. And how we phrase that language is totally up to you. These are your rules, and this body has the power to amend its own rules. Susan.
I think perhaps could we not take care of it? If we have the discretion to defer, we have the discretion to not defer. And I don't know why, again, to the doctrine of whatever that Latin phrase is, expressio inclusio thing. But you know, if we start listing why we cannot, I mean, don't we, discretion is discretion. And if we get too tricky, and having discretion in the first sentence is not necessarily presumptive discretion to me. So sometimes I think the words are pretty plain. Discretion, having discretion to defer allows us to defer.
I understand your point, and at some level, I don't disagree. I think an argument in response to that is that sometimes municipal bodies like the articulation of specific factors that help guide the exercise of discretion, that are transparent to the public, and that help guide a municipal body in the exercise, an appropriate exercise of the discretion. So that would be the rationale for at least identifying some, whether it's an exhaustive list or not, factors to help guide the discretion, really in the sake of transparency.
What you think?
If I could weigh in as a person who is not legally trained, as a layperson, a legal layperson reviewing this, and although I'm very open to a discussion about how the phrase is introduced, perhaps there's a better word to introduce the phrase than among the factors, but for transparency purposes and guidance purposes for future planning commissions as well as developers, what they may expect as a part of the discussion when they're coming in, I would like to see some exemplars included in the language.
Well, if we may, following the, please.
No, I was just going to say, the first sentence, as I read it, gives the Planning Commission discretion to defer, but goes on, the wording goes on to state, but absent compelling reasons to the contrary shall defer. So I think that's pretty clear that while we have the discretion, the presumption is that we will do it. I was, in full disclosure, one of, I think, the members who I contacted Mr. Mehta when these rules first came out in draft form and suggested including standards. I think having standards are very important to give both the property owners and the commission and any interested member of the public some notion of what we think would be a reasonable basis to defer, because the point of this is that if you have a property owner who comes before us and who has a variety of additional governmental authorizations that are going to be necessary before the site can be approved, and they are, some of them could be local, city, state, federal, and we have situations like that. I think that it's very important that the Planning Commission have the discretion to manage its own calendar in a way that accommodates on a reasonable basis both the property owner's interests in having these proceedings advance on a timely basis, but also managing the time that the Planning Commission has to spend on any one item, because it's quite likely that at least in the future we're going to have a number of items on the agenda. As to the word among, I don't object to it, but I would certainly not want to take it out unless we use something along the lines of the factors that may be considered include but are not limited to. I mean, that's another way to get to the same place legally, if you think among is maybe vague, and including but not limited to is pretty standard legal language in statutes, contracts, and so forth.
I think your observation that we are going to have a lot on our calendar is correct. Ms. Womack, was an application for another hotel filed very recently? Okay, so that will be number 3.
It's for the Atlantic Crown on Baltimore Avenue.
Okay.
Concept.
So where are we? Yes, sir.
I wanted to sort of go back and draw on the comments that were just made that were good. I think there is general agreement if you just have the first sentence you have a clear statement that the commission has the discretion to defer, and you have a measuring stick identified, if you will, compelling reasons. What these latest comments focused in on is, do we want to enumerate, what those considerations are? And if so, do we want to identify an exclusive list? In other words, the commission shall look at only these things, or do we want to use words like, including but not limited to, which would allow the commission to focus on identified factors plus additional factors? In my mind, and I do not have the experience in this area that most of you have, but the answer to that in my mind turns in large measure on how busy you want to be in this area. For instance, if you do not identify an exclusive list, but you have factors identified, then you are going to have people coming to you saying, you have to consider these things, but I would like you also to consider the following things. You have kind of a floating yardstick, if you will. I don't know how often we're going to be confronted with these kinds of requests, but in my mind, I was thinking you either have the first sentence and nothing, or the first sentence and an exclusive list, which really guides the commission in determining what are the factors that would establish compelling reasons. That, in my mind, promotes certainty, both for the commission members and for the applicants, which to me is, a rule of good governance. So again,
So may I make, with the goal of trying to move the discussion forward, let me make the following drafting suggestions. I don't vote, but I can help draft. So perhaps in the first sentence, we can make the following change. The Planning Commission shall have the discretion to defer, strike, and absent compelling reasons, and insert, and presumptively shall defer.
Or, because that was going to be my point, it's weird in the first preamble to have discretion.
Yeah.
And that, if somebody's looking at this prior to where they're just reading it at home or where they're building or whatever, they want to know what step do I have to take? And if it says we shall defer, then they kind of have to come here and find out if we're going to defer. And shouldn't the preamble say we shall defer absent either compelling reasons or defined compelling reasons?
So perhaps, subject to, maybe say along the following lines, subject to the factors listed below, the Planning Commission shall presumptively defer a preliminary review of yada, yada, yada.
I wouldn't say subject to the factors. I mean, that makes it really contingent on maybe any sort of reasonable evidence of one of the factors. But the Planning Commission shall defer, yes, it shall defer.
Yeah.
And absent compelling reasons to the contrary, absent compelling reasons to the contrary, a preliminary review of yada, yada, yada. In determining whether compelling reasons not to defer exist, the Planning Commission may consider, and then the factors that are listed. I mean, this is pretty much off the top of my head, but I think that, I think Commissioner Stewart is right, that it's not a double negative in that first sentence, but it does seem to kind of point in two directions at one time. Yeah. And it just makes it more clear, the planning commission shall defer absent
Compelling reasons.
compelling reasons.
And
Yeah.
then if you
And
want
then
to
if-
define compelling reasons include but are not limited to, boom.
And it's a may, so
Yeah.
you know, it's a presumptive deferral, and the commission may look at these things. It doesn't have
Right.
to. It can look
Right.
at other things if it chooses to do that.
If I may, though, if you make the first sentence mandatory, the planning commission shall defer, and then you come down and say, the following factors include, but, you know, the following factors which the planning commission may consider in deferring its, whether to defer is the following. So that almost makes the intro, almost makes it sound like it's not a mandatory deferral. That the first sentence.
Confusing right now.
Yeah.
But I think if you said the planning commission shall defer unless there are compelling reasons which lead them to believe that deferral is not warranted, and then stay what they are.
Can't you just say the planning commission shall defer absent compelling reasons to the
Yes.
contrary?
Right.
That's what
And
I
then when
heard.
you get down to that second sentence, instead of talking about factors, say among the reasons, because then that ties it back to the first sentence. These are the reasons that may be considered, but they include but are not limited to.
Right.
Because I really think, and I think, Earl, you made the point in saying there could be a number of additional reasons, and each case can be different. Each case probably will be different. Each property owner will consider his situation, rightly or wrongly, unique. We may or may not agree with that, but I think flexibility is important, but I agree. I think we do need reasons spelled out that are examples of what
Right.
could be compelling reasons.
Right.
Mr. Mehta, would you like to use your penmanship to come up with something while we move on to another item?
However you want to do it, that's fine with
Well,
me. I don't think it'll take that long, so I've read, so live here, is that the current first sentence now would read, "The planning commission shall defer, absent compelling reasons to the contrary, a preliminary review of, or a public hearing or final action on, a site plan for which variance, rezoning, and or other authorization under applicable federal, state, county, or city laws and regulations is required until such time as the variance, rezoning, and or other government authorizations is obtained."
Let's stop there then.
Yes.
What-
Can
what do you
we
say?
pop out the clause absent compelling reasons and put it at the end of obtained and before the period? So it's a sentence that says, shall defer a preliminary view of a site plan that's got other things to go through first until authorization is obtained unless a compelling reason exists to for deferral.
Not defer. Unless compelling
Yeah,
reason is not
sorry,
defer.
yeah. I've twisted myself into a
Right,
knot,
right, I
I'm
know.
sorry.
Well, it's part of the
Part of the beauty
reason
of
for the
words.
language issues, yeah.
And then if you do that, the may, you know, allows the list to grow as the commission deems it should grow. I don't want to prolong this, but I do want to go back to two minor points. I'm not sure what we get out of the phrase about the applicant opposing deferral. I would tend to discard that. And I guess I still have a question about the phrase, the extent of authorizations. Does extent refer to a number, or does it refer to the complexity, or both, or
Could be
scope?
both. It could be
Scope
both.
is,
So we could take out extent and say the number, degree, and complexity, and/or complexity.
yeah, that Sounds better to me.
I mean, a good example of that would be a plus review.
Yeah.
That is required, and it's, can be extensive, and it can be complex, and it can be all of those things. So,
I think that would give us a little more specificity.
and then delete the the consent of the applicant.
Right.
Okay. I think it's presumed that they won't consent. Okay.
Well, if they will, you don't need this.
Well, the reason that was in there could go the other way. I mean, it could also be that an applicant is in favor of deferral, and this would make it very evident to the public that, you know, why the planning commission is exercising deferral, which includes maybe the applicant wants the deferral. Maybe the applicant has made a submission and then wants deferral. That scenario,
we
but I have
don't-
no problem taking it out.
We don't need that anymore now because deferral is what we shall do.
I agree.
Need to say including but not, what was the language?
Not
Including but not limited to.
Yeah, but not limited, right. Does it need to say that for those reasons? Including but not limited to.
Yeah, because you could never come up with the absolutely
Right.
most
You
comprehensive
could just
list that
say
would cover every
compelling
case.
factors include but are not limited to.
Yeah, that's,
Right. Instead of among the factors and all that.
Well,
I don't know if that was a good suggestion.
yeah, unless a compelling reason exists not to defer. So if an applicant wanted to proceed, that applicant would have to demonstrate a compelling reason. And the factors would be what would amount to a compelling reason. I mean, that's not the way I want it to be in the language, but I mean, that's the logic of it, I think, just in terms of how the word compelling gets used. I mean, the other thing that troubles me a little bit, I don't know exactly how to resolve this, but when the applicant reasonably expects to receive the requisite authorizations and approvals.
Again, the idea there is, again, to give this body some flexibility. You're not just an automaton. You are a public body with smart people. You can exercise some degree of discretion. And let's say the only identifiable federal, state, or local approval or authorization that's required is a de minimis approval that is expected to be obtained promptly, that would not otherwise require an extensive amount of time to obtain, or a lot of time by this body, then maybe in that situation say, hey, yeah, let's go ahead forward, and if it hasn't been obtained, maybe we make it a condition of approval, but you know, we're ready to go forward at least with preliminary review.
But instead of the word when, what if we put the date by which the applicant reasonably expects to receive?
Yeah, I mean, if an applicant has if it is a reasonable basis for expectation, then, you know, that's one thing, but it's, you know, I mean, we've all had, I mean, we're all aware of situations in which approvals can take longer than one would like. I mean, it just makes it a fudge factor that I'm not entirely comfortable with.
well, how about the time frame within which the applicant expects, that rather than a precise date?
Yeah,
Or
that's
when is
something.
a little vague, but the
Yeah,
time
when-
frame within which.
Time frame, I agree. Doesn't have to be the
And I-
precise date.
I think, you know, a reason to not defer presumes that whatever these things that they haven't gotten yet,
Excuse me, I think it's a reason to defer.
well, I guess what I'm saying, it shall defer,
Uh-huh.
but if there's variances or things that are going to impact, I mean, we had a hotel discuss, and again, it wasn't a formal site plan review, but it had a big variance that you almost can't get the site plan review. So my point is, we don't want to review things even if they're compelling, I don't think, if we can't do the work here of reviewing it, because that's just wheel spinning and hearing holding that if you have these obstacles. So I don't know if that could be addressed. You know, it just seems like a grand waste of time to have something that so clearly is out of, that needs a huge variance. And then, because you almost can't talk about the substance of it without understanding whether that's been resolved.
The presumption is we will defer.
Yes, as long as the presumption is that we shall defer.
Right, I'm saying, but let's say there's compelling reasons not to defer. So we're talking, we're having a hypothetical, we're talking about not deferring. I would say that well, maybe it's taken care of, never mind. I think, but you know what I'm talking about? There could be compelling reasons, but it still makes it a waste of time to do it until other things are critical, things are resolved.
So let me, I think I'm trying to capture these
Yeah.
excellent comments live, so let me try to read it.
Got too many
to you.
lawyers on this commission.
Look, these are your rules. I think it's an important topic, you know.
And
this
we're
is-
not getting paid
thi-
hourly
This
either.
is the, this is an issue that this body's been considering for months. It's obviously important to this body. I think it's really important that you get it right, that you all understand what it means, that the public understands what it means, but that you get something done today. So let me read what I currently have based on what I think I'm hearing today. And the first sentence would be as follows. The Planning Commission shall defer a preliminary review of or a public hearing or final action on a site plan for which a variance, rezoning, and/or other authorization under applicable federal, state, county, or city laws and regulations is required. By the way, again, that phrase comes right out of the city code. Until such time as the variance, rezoning, and/or other government authorization is obtained, unless a compelling reason exists not to defer. Factors the Planning Commission may consider in exercising its discretion to overcome such presumptive deferral include, but are not limited to, the following. The amount of time the Planning Commission is expected to expend on a site plan that has not received requisite authorizations and approvals. The time frame in which the applicant reasonably expects to receive the requisite authorizations and approvals. The number, degree, and/or complexity of requisite authorizations and approvals, and whether the requisite authorizations and approvals could be made a condition of site plan approval.
I have one additional comment. In the phrase, if I followed you correctly, where you say unless, I'm proposing that we say unless the Planning Commission determines, because what I'm trying to
Perfect.
establish is it's in the sole discretion of the Planning Commission as opposed to, you know, APA reasonable review standard.
So unless the Planning Commission determines a compelling reason?
That
Oh,
a
I think
compelling
what
reason.
she's saying, and I, are both of them, in words, yes, unless the planning,
Commission determines that.
yes.
That there is.
Yeah, I would rather have the determination of what is compelling, that decision made by the Planning Commission, than an applicant arguing everything's compelling. We're going to lose $8 million next week, by way of example. I hear that all the time in some land use issues back in Virginia. So,
Luke, can you put your new version up there?
I just did.
Oh, okay,
I
got
just-
it.
I'm editing it live.
Sorry, okay.
So now the first sentence would read as follows. The Planning Commission shall defer a preliminary review. We're not talking about project concept reviews here. Shall defer a preliminary review of, or a public hearing or final action on, a site plan for which a variance, rezoning, and/or other authorization under applicable federal, state, county, or city laws and regulations is required, until such time as the variance, rezoning, and/or other governmental authorization is obtained, unless the Planning Commission determines that a compelling reason exists not to defer.
Stop there. Does anybody have any concerns with that sentence as structured now? Yes, sir.
One question. I don't have a concern, but for the group, do we want to say a compelling reason, or do we want to say compelling reasons? I'm okay with it the way it's written, but I just posed that question.
So in other words, that more than one
Yes.
compelling reason exists. Would we be requiring that more than one reason exists to be determined to be
I
compelling?
think that's Earl's point.
Yes.
I mean, must all of them be compelling?
And that's why I'm kind of in favor of the language that is there, but I am just pointing that out because it will be.
Yeah, so the way I read this, of course, I read my own language the way I read it. It's a compelling reason, but the factors
Factors are singular.
determine
reason is-
the compelling reason or not.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Okay, so okay on the first sentence?
Yep.
Mr. Walls?
I had a quick question about the first sentence and that you're specifying review of a preliminary plan?
We're talking about preliminary review or a public hearing or final action on. We're not
Okay.
talking about project concept review here.
Okay, so there's no need, specifying that the preliminary stage is sufficient to cover all your needs there. Does that question make sense?
I mean, it's a term of art under the code that clearly does not
Yep,
cover project concept review.
okay. And where'd it go? I think it expends on a site plan. Does it need to refer to the site plan, or do you want to make that more general to any plan?
So these
Just-
these rules are expressly pursuant to Chapter 236 of the code.
Okay,
I think it's quite clear.
very good.
So are we satisfied that the first sentence is in good shape?
Yes.
Then the second sentence would go on to help inform you and inform the public about what could be a compelling reason not to defer. Factors the Planning Commission may consider in exercising its discretion to overcome such presumptive deferral include but are not limited to the amount of time the Planning Commission is expected to expend on a site plan that has not received requisite authorizations and approvals, the time frame in which the applicant reasonably expects to receive the requisite authorizations and approvals, the number, degree, and/or complexity of requisite authorizations and approvals, and whether the requisite authorizations and approvals could be made a condition of site plan approval. I'm going to
Any additional thoughts to that?
before-
Anyone? Well, it must be perfect.
Print it, quick.
Is there a motion to approve section
moved.
14?
Not just, well, you want to do section 14, or do you want to do the entire set of rules?
Entire set. The entire set of rules as proposed.
So moved.
Ms. Davis, second?
Second.
Mr. Stockdale?
You have a question on another section of the rules, Commissioner?
I think this is the only one.
Yes, I guess my other comment was on the code itself.
Yes,
So-
and we're deferring that.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay. All right, so we have a motion to approve the procedures, correct?
The
rules, I'm
Planning
sorry.
Commission's rules of procedure.
Rules of procedure. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? The rules of procedure are adopted. And they are effective today, is that correct, Mr.?
They are effective right now, and
Thank you.
it's dated for today. I think there ought to be, the secretary ought to sign it to make it clear, and in my view, they ought to be obviously available.
Are we not doing the minor bylaw change, the little word?
We already did that.
Did that? I missed it, sorry. Yeah, no, I forgot, I forgot that we had to do that.
That was the only one where we have to
I
schedule.
seconded the motion,
Yeah,
sorry.
yes, I think,
Yes.
okay. All right, then we're done with rules and of procedure and bylaws, correct? All right, Ms. Gay.
Well,
I've asked Susan Gay to please take charge of the proposed parking recommendations to the Board of Commissioners. She was on the Board of Commissioners when this issue was referred to us and is quite knowledgeable and I think has put in a lot of work. So would you please move forward?
okay, thank you. First of all, I guess it was yesterday or day before, I sent out some materials to you all that had come from Wallace Montgomery, as well as a cover memo trying to basically frame the voluminous amount of possibilities that exist for commercial parking code. What I didn't put in that memo, because I wanted to say it here, I thought it was better to sort of share in a public meeting and maybe get the conversation started, is some background about where I think we are in the code and the sorts of things we need to look at and why the code is like it is today and all of that. But first of all, I would like to thank very much Wallace Montgomery for the research they provided, especially the information on hotels. Frankly, it was more than I expected, and it was extremely educational for me because I had done, a previous comparison of just local towns, I think plus Cape May, and their research was much broader. And so now I feel like we truly have a handle on all of the possible codes that are out there, nationwide. But one of the first things that jumped out at me was seeing all those codes, and I don't know if you've had a chance to scroll through them or not, but one of the things that jumped out at me is just convinced me further that we have one of the most generous codes in the country. Not just hotel parking requirements, but for offices and shops and restaurants and every other kind of commercial use. The great majority of towns that were cited in the research that Wallace Montgomery provided require parking for these types of uses. And we do not, except for over a certain size. It really seems to me that in addition to the size and density of a town, the unique characteristics and the geography come into play in determining how those codes are built. And for that reason, no two are alike. I mean, that's why you have so many different combinations and permutations. So for Rehoboth, I mean, to me, the brand is our small boutique restaurants and shops. And also, our code in numerous respects is built for scale. So that's the reason why the parking code, written however many years back it was written, has the small uses not requiring parking, but the larger uses that might overwhelm the smaller uses requiring parking. I think that's why it was built that way. It was built for scale. But interestingly, in addition, if you think about our commercial district geographically, the CDP says it is only 60 acres, 12.6% of the city. So our commercial district is actually quite small, and it's contained in a small area. And because of that, it's also hard to imagine every restaurant, needing parking, especially the small ones. But as it is now, our code does require parking for restaurants and other uses over either 10,000 or 15,000 square feet. And so the reason that right now, and I know we're going to look at all the commercial code to see if any other aspects of it need to be tweaked. But the reason that I zeroed in initially on hotels is that they present an outsized impact on the city, bringing more cars and people into town and therefore potentially adversely affecting the small businesses that we're trying to protect. I do think that the code is out of date. And one of the ways you can see that is that our current requirement for hotel parking is 1 space per room plus 2 for the resident family. How many hotels have a resident family these days? So, in looking at the codes from elsewhere in the country, others have been brought up to date to basically take into account other uses within the hotel besides just the people sleeping in the rooms, either for staff or for meeting rooms or for other commercial uses. So that's kind of where we are. And then so what I tried to do in the cover memo was on page 2, I created yet another chart, but it has, I guess, about 8 or so categories, if you will, of the kinds of requirements that you see in other codes. almost, every other code starts out with a base, the number of spaces per room. And then you add on to that base, whether it's for meeting space, employees, ancillary uses, whatever. So I think that's what we need to come up with, and my feeling is, if we get the second part of that equation right, if we can get an equation right that works for the ancillary uses within the hotels, and I want Nick to speak to this too, because he had some very good ideas about it, then we may be able to leave the base as one and add beyond that, rather than making it 1.25 or 1.5, whatever. So that's sort of my intro to it. And
You know, one thing I think that might be explored is whether commercial uses within a single building should be considered
Right.
in the aggregate versus store by store by store, in terms of whether there are parking requirements for commercial uses. So that's another thing that I think we need to be aware of, that currently, it's my understanding, these commercial uses are based on store by store by store, not by the fact that you have 5 stores on the first floor of a building with a single ownership. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, correct, yes.
Okay. Right. Would you like to pick up on where Susan left off?
Certainly. As Susan indicated, this is a pretty complex issue when you get down to it. You're trying to balance the need for increasing parking for guests and visitors to the city, but at the same time, you don't want to sort of take away usable, valuable land within the CDP for parking. They're probably better uses. But at the same time, there's a balance to be struck between those. So how do you find that balance? Well, how other places have tried to do it is through what what Susan has laid out here in the base approach and the cumulative impact. And I think that's a good strategy to begin with. I think that it forms a understandable approach for most people to read the code, interpret what it says, and come up with that. I think critically, as Michael indicated, we need to consider the fact that the larger hotels being proposed, I'm going to say multi-use hotels, in that it's more than just resident rooms, it's restaurant, commercial, recreational, pools, bars, and the commercial areas. Right now, a lot of the current plans seem to be splitting those commercial entities apart, and in that way, they don't exceed that 15,000 square foot threshold. When you consider that the entire parcel is under singular ownership and that these commercial entities are typically going to be leasees who have very little control over the long-term dimensions and conditions of their lease, you could find a situation where 10 years from now, the property owner wants to remove all of those separate entities, put it into one thing, and next thing you know, you've got a wedding venue, you've got a very intense commercial activity that is going to drive additional vehicles to that site beyond just those who would be staying there. It could also be similar to a conference room or a conference activity. They have, some of these hotels will have significant conference amenities with the goal being to draw people in. Draw people beyond just their guests at that time. So I think we need to look at these ancillary uses and make sure that they are categorized correctly under the code, but also cumulatively accounted for, because there's too much opportunity in the future for change to occur that may or may not then come back here and may or may not have any additional requirements for parking. So basically, let's get the number calculated right the first time when it comes through. That way we don't have to worry as much about what happens down the road.
Now, something you said, I'm sorry? Something that you said that caught my attention is this business about singular ownership. I think a pretty savvy land use attorney might say, you know, we're gonna convert those commercial spaces to condos, and we'll put those in LLC number 5 and 6 and 7 and 8, and therefore, Mr. Planning Commission, we don't have a singular ownership. So before someone tells us that, I would just like to have you think about how that might, do we want to talk about commercial space within the structure in which the hotel is located?
Yes, yes, because you're absolutely right. You know, the ownership issue could be subdivided. So the intent being, if you're talking about this parcel, this development, let's look at everything within it.
I'm wondering, first of all, thank you very much for this compilation of information and for your remarks, very helpful to me. In digesting this material, I was struck by, you know, how differently everyone approaches this. And I could see, you know, in my mind, some of the drivers for that. You know, some would be the geography of the town, other considerations like that. As I try to think through this and consider the information that is laid out to us, I'm wondering, in my mind, it would be helpful if we could clarify the target we're shooting at, the short-term goal, if you will. In other words, for instance, if the idea is to address hotel space plus accompanying commercial space, I would find it kind of helpful at the get-go to kind of agree on that, because when I looked at the data, what I saw was, you know, a number of jurisdictions having separate rules depending on the type of activity that was involved. If we go down that path, I see two concerns. One, I see, you know, the problem of unintended consequences. We make a change, you know, directed at hotels, and we send off fireworks all over the rest of the city. The other thing is, I was struck by Susan's well-chosen words when she said that, you know, some of the considerations were relating to hotels were driven by protections for other businesses, okay, in terms of parking. Well, if you keep that in mind, then I think that augurs in against, if you will, discriminating on the basis of the type of establishment that's involved. Because if I was a small business owner and I had one rule, but I'm the exact same business in the hotel and I have a different rule, then I've got a disparity of treatment consideration involved. So in my mind, it would be helpful to clarify if the target we're shooting at is hotels with commercial space. You know, if we could agree on that right away, then I think you start moving toward, well, if that's the short-term target, we should have either a number for rooms that could change after a threshold is broken, which is what some jurisdictions do, Or we could have a base and we could have a floating rule, or and we could tie that to what's going on now, one per room up to a certain amount and then additional amount. We could talk about whether it makes any difference whether there's a kitchen involved or not. I see some hotels distinguish on that. In my mind, unless you have multiple rooms involved, again, I'm throwing this out without much expertise in the area, that's less of a consideration because I think the rooms are limited in terms of how many they accommodate, by space. So I'm not sure if kitchens are a big deal. But then the other thing is commercial space. If we're not going to distinguish based on the type of business, which I am thinking does raise issues, then you're sort of guided toward picking a rule based on employees or based on a square footage or something like that. So again, I threw out a lot based on a quick study and no background expertise. But to me, what's key is what's the short-term target? Let's build some fair considerations about wiggle room, where we can work without creating other problems for the city, and then craft some rules around that.
Nick, would it affect your opinion if, given the situation that we currently have in Rehoboth, where there really is no land available in the city for surface parking, correct?
Right,
And we
pretty
don't-
limited.
Yes, and we don't have a parking
up.
garage and aren't going to get one. So parking is a premium, and particularly during the season, you have parking available downtown, but it's full. So those jurisdictions that are perhaps more generous with per parking space per room may have surface parking available, correct?
Yes,
and
or
so-
or at least land that could be,
Yeah,
yes.
and since we
yes.
don't have that,
Right.
that might, in my estimation, support a different number in terms of how many parking spaces you require per room in hotels. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
We also don't, I mean, this is a driving, people get here by driving. There's
Yes.
no airport. There really is not much car sharing
No.
capacity here. And it's one big funnel and I agree. So I think it would be good we're different even when we look at other cities with the same density.
Right.
I think it understates the downtown car density.
Right.
Yeah.
And people, when they go to restaurants, they don't necessarily drive. I mean, they might, but I think if you're coming to a hotel, you're generally driving to get there. So, I mean, because restaurants can be supported by people who live here or walking, or people who are dispersed from Rehoboth Avenue or Baltimore and who are walking to the restaurants. So that would be a reason to treat a restaurant or retail differently than a hotel, which the nexus to driving is more strong.
And if I could reply to some of Earl's points, parking has been a huge issue in Rehoboth forever, and we can't solve the whole thing all in one process. And where do we focus? There's, in my view, an immediacy around the hotel question because we have multiple large projects that are coming down the pipeline. And I recognize that the entire problem of parking can't be addressed fully until we look at each layer of the onion. But there's just that huge layer that needs a focus. And a point that you brought up earlier, and it's one that I've only really become to appreciate as more luxurious, more complex hotels are being proposed, is the impact of event-based customers coming in, not necessarily for the restaurant, but for the wedding that's being presented there, or the singer and the performance that's going to be there. You know, and all those are wonderful activities. They bring value to the town, absolutely. But what's the impact and how can we plan in advance for those impacts?
Exactly.
Yeah, I appreciate Earl's comment about the discriminating against the small users that might be located within the hotels. I had thought about that, and I think when you talk about the target, it does seem like that the last 4 or 5, more than that, hotels that have built in town are building more than just a hotel. They are building, you know, commercial space or event space or whatever. And at the same time, the other reason, and this came forward, you know, several years ago in discussions, is that, and I think it was the code enforcement officer at the time said that typically you're getting more than 1 car per room, even though you wouldn't think that, but I guess they do. I mean, I guess rooms that might have 2 double beds, you know, two cars will come, whatever. And so he said it really is more than 1. So that my initial thought was that we should do more than 1 space per room, and then when I thought about how large the other commercial spaces and how many spaces that might require, that's why I thought, well, we could stick to the base. But it may be that the answer to the whole thing, both because of that trend of more than 1 car per room and wanting to protect the small businesses, the formula may be better for us to just kick up the minimum spaces per room and let that basically solve the problem for the meeting space. I don't know, or you could do, and I think we may already do, well, we don't do it for parking, but there's other elements of the commercial code that does this, where we would maybe require some additional space for the meeting rooms, right? Meeting rooms and offices or something like that, but not the commercial space.
Yeah, I agree, Susan. One of the concerns I've had in looking in this and considering it, an awful lot of the Wallace Montgomery research, it was very interesting, but we don't know which of these jurisdictions have public parking garages,
Right.
you know,
Yeah, that's one thing we
good
didn't
public
pull, yeah.
transportation,
That's
park and
the key.
ride facilities that people actually use.
Right?
I mean, there are just so many variables that it's very hard to know. But a second observation, which goes to Susan, you know, discriminating against the small businesses, you know, a store, to say that retail and restaurant space is going to have parking requirements if they're in a hotel, or they're going to be factored into the parking requirements for a hotel, does seem somewhat unfair, because as a practical matter, they could be freestanding
Right.
next door and
Yeah.
have no parking requirement whatsoever,
No, I
either
agree.
one.
Yeah.
So I agree. I think it's the event space, the meeting rooms, the conference spaces. I mean, there's at least one hotel in the vicinity of the boardwalk that has a lot of conference space, a lot of meeting rooms, and I've gone to conferences there. Now, I can, you know, walk down the boardwalk and get there, but other people drive,
Yeah.
and they do have a fair amount of on-site parking, but that's what really draws, and it is the events, and we're becoming more of a destination. The special weekends, the festivals, and so forth. I think that's really the issue we should be focusing on.
Well, do you support Susan's thought that maybe the answer, rather than getting down into the weeds about
Yes, I
whether
do.
it is to just look at the number for the per room in the hotel, how many spaces are required?
I think that's at least a reasonable approach. I don't know that there aren't others that we haven't talked about yet. We haven't talked about hotel employees, for example.
Right.
And I realize the difficulties of categorizing both who is an employee, the shifts, full-time, part-time, all
Seasonal
of that. But-
fluctuations.
And
Seasonal
knowing that
issues and so
information
forth,
at
but-
this stage, that's the other
That's
issue. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
And no, and I agree, but I just wanted to if we're going to put it on the table and then take it off,
Yeah.
because it is a consideration that a lot of these other codes do have requirements based on employee numbers.
I mean, one concern I have is just what are we incentivizing and what are we disincentivizing by these numbers? And I feel like I don't have a strong sense of that yet. Are we incentivizing, you know, carving up structures in ways where some functions are just slightly under, you know, the trigger number, and those are functions that would logically, you know, require parking spaces? Are we incentivizing something else? Is it going to drive hotel restaurants in one direction or the other? I just don't have a sense of that.
Well, and partially coming to that precise point, Nancy, and as a citizen trying to follow the details and all of the ins and outs of various projects, I wish I could think as creatively as some of the developers do in finding the loopholes. They have there are some talented folk out there. So in my point of view, the more straightforward the rule is, the less wiggle room there is around the rule, the less freedom of interpretation. And I totally recognize that a one-size-fits, 1.89 spaces per room, that may or may not be the best way to go, and there's a lot of discussion that needs to occur. But absent that level of precision and narrow definition, it's just a whole game that's waiting to happen.
Now, does Wallace Montgomery anticipate having some newer technology to help with this process?
Yes, yes. So we just yesterday purchased the Institute for Traffic Engineering's model parking manual and calculation sheets. And basically, it's a national organization that summarizes best practices in engineering and provides guidance for the development community to use those in, well, not just the developers, but for commissions like yourselves to establish minimums, to identify, what your future needs are. We just purchased it yesterday. We are working through licensing and unlocking the PDF, and should have that hopefully by now. So we are combing through that to try and pull a little bit more research-based information to support this discussion. And sort of along those lines, I think that to the point of, what do we need to focus on now versus what should our larger focus be, I would suggest consideration of an updated parking study for the city. I think that the complexity and needs are more than sufficient to justify that expenditure. It's not something that we do particularly, but there are firms out there who do nothing but parking because it is such a complex issue. We've been talking mostly about the commercial activities, but should there be any consideration of residential issues?
There has to be. Yeah, we're just doing this one first.
Yeah, right,
That's
exactly.
another
but-
topic for another day, but yes, that everyone understands that needs to be looked at as well.
Yeah, I think so. Long-term, that
Yeah.
head towards there, but for now, we've got the elephant in the room.
You have to
is
start
these hel-
somewhere.
Is these hotels. Yep.
Are we going to have access to that manual?
That is a good question. Because of copyright issues, I need to review and see to what degree we can provide excerpts. You'll certainly be able to read our analysis that's based off of it.
Was this purchased by the city or by your company?
By our company. And it's an individual license. So I'm not personally familiar with the restrictions on use because it was purchased through the engineering side. But once I have clarity on that, we will provide as much as we can to you.
Is it inappropriate to ask how much that cost?
$300
Oh, that's not bad. We should do that.
per copy,
Per individual. seat.
per individual copy, yes.
Sorry, how much was it?
300.
I vote that we buy one for Susan.
Well,
I'll chip in.
In all
we do
seriousness,
have a
I think
budget.
$300 divided by 7.
Or we could take up a collection.
I think one of the issues that has been perplexing to me for several years is that the city has not made available to the Planning Commission a lot of resources that quite frankly should be available because they didn't pay for it. And I think this is a very good example, and we appreciate your being here. But I think also the Planning Commission needs access to documents more than just what's available on the internet, but actual professional societies that you do have to pay a fee to get. Now, in many cases, several of us are members of organizations where we have access because we pay the bill. And that's great, but there are other examples where we don't, and this would be an excellent example of that. That's a valuable document. Now, there's other documents that indirectly refer to parking in organizations that I'm a member of, but it's not sufficient for what you just described. And I think the assessment that we need to take a total view of it as Susan pointed out, is absolutely correct. And because there's always pros and cons to the totality of it. The two spaces per residential dwelling unit has been, I don't know how far back it goes, actually, but there was an uproar from developers when it was proposed by the previous consultant to the city that was in your position. And they all were negative on anything more than 2 spaces. Now, there were environmental conditions that had to be assessed, and it wasn't an easy solution. You just couldn't say, well, if you've got 5 bedrooms, you need 3 spaces. But by only having 2 spaces per dwelling unit, and as Susan pointed out, 80% of our space, more than 80% of our space is residential. And right now, there's no house has been constructed in Rehoboth Beach in the last 3 years that has less than 5 bedrooms. And most of those are rented. And most of them don't come in 2 cars.
Definitely.
Which in turn takes up all the spaces on the street, and you buy a permit. But the point is, in balance, that has a very big impact both on the commercial district and the residential district, because parking is a totality. We don't differentiate on why was the car there. So yes, I would like to propose that we get a license for this body.
If you don't mind, let me take a look at it first and recommend to you if it's even worth it.
Okay.
To make sure, that way we can just make sure that it has the information in
Okay.
it that we expect it to. And that, Monday, Tuesday next week, we should be able to say positively, yes, this will be helpful, or, well, it's helpful, but not as much as we'd hoped, so.
Right.
And we do have a budget. The city has agreed to fund certain things for the planning commission. And for example, if we have an application that requires expertise beyond what Nick can offer, we can hire other consultants
Okay.
to deal with those type, somewhat unique issues.
Yep.
Okay.
So just keep that in mind, and when it's necessary, let's discuss it. Let's see what we need to do. That was one of the concerns I really had after the clear space matter,
Right.
because we didn't have that.
Yeah, because I mean, at the moment, quite frankly, I have access to an awful lot of, because I'm an engineer and a PhD planner, of societies that I'm a member of, that I draw a lot of text from and valuable information. And the city gets that free because obviously I'm paying for it.
Sure.
And it's appropriate because that's what my profession is. But there are some things where you need up-to-date information, which unfortunately is only available from societies that you can only get unless you pay for it. Either be a member of it or purchase the book or text or the PDF as it was in order to get updated information.
And I'm sorry, to be clear, that the cost that I quoted you was for a ITE member price.
Right.
So our organization, we have individuals in our company who are ITE members. I don't know that it's available. I would assume it's available for a non-member, just at a
It usually is. and it's
outrageous
usually-
price.
It's usually sufficiently high that you are forced to become a member in
Bingo.
order to purchase it.
Yep.
Is our job with regard to the whole parking to make a recommendation to the commissioners?
Yes.
Okay.
In fact, one of the, when Nan brought up the issue of incentivizing, and in many respects, like I said before, our code is built for scale, and I think because of that, we incentivize small scale. We incentivize small restaurants, small shops, or whatever. And for that reason, that's yet another reason to not have the new code take those, compel parking for those small uses. It sounds to me like the simplest thing would be to look at, I'm just going to throw this out for discussion. I just thought of it, so it's not, I don't have any, firm opinions about it, but, like 1.5 spaces per room plus requirements for meeting rooms and offices in the hotel on a square footage basis. And offices, that may be something Matt already does, because we do have in our code a use for an office, and it says 1 for each 400 square feet for office purposes. But I don't know whether historically we've done that or not, but certainly going forward, we should make it clear that we would want to count offices as well as meeting space. And then we would just have to decide what the right square footage is. It might be as low as 200 square feet.
Well, and St. Michael's has one sort of modeled that way, 1.5 for sleeping room and 1 for every 3-person maximum occupancy
Right?
of the conference center.
Right.
Well, as I say, what is unique about Rehoboth is there just is no available surface parking. So I'm not sure how that works into the analysis of your new computer program, but it may not.
It may not. And there are several other conditions specific to Rehoboth that are going to be problematic. Your proximity to the water obviously creates a lot of floodplain issues. And as we know, there is not a lot of surface area, so we're either going to be going up or down. And both of those have significant engineering considerations that are going to influence the cost. And so you might have a case where a hotel developer, looks at those increased requirements and is a little frustrated. But it's the nature of the game.
Any other thoughts? Mr. Ellison?
Just one. I think Susan may be on the right direction. When I read all of this material and tried to begin to assess it, it felt to me like it would be so much easier for us to deal with it if we had a specific proposal
Yes.
before us.
And I had wanted to do that today, but we had so much information.
Right, yeah.
We had to discuss it.
I think that would be helpful. The other point is that I think whatever we decide, we already have 2 major projects that we have already, in a very cursory preliminary way, we've spoken to, and yet we may be coming forth with requirement changes that will affect both of those projects. So I think we need to be on as firm a set of grounds as we can be before we proceed, because we'll be in serious trouble, I'm sure, with those developers.
Well, I'd like to also keep, if everyone would stay on task, and let's deal with this issue promptly so that there is, like you say, some certainty in the marketplace. And so,
One of the reasons why we didn't provide a concrete proposal for discussion today was because I wanted to get a sense from all of you how to focus. Was the focus to be the ratio on a number of rooms? Or were we going to consider additional retail or cumulative retail? Or what direction in general do we want to go first? And it seems like the most straightforward answer is the room count. Plus meetings. And I think having that understanding of general agreement on that direction, we can come back to you next week with a more specific proposal that incorporates the ITE data as well as your input.
And just a clarification question, Susan, what are you including as meeting space or other related uses?
Well, I was thinking, meeting rooms that are actually designated as meeting rooms that are designated as meeting rooms. But are you saying that, are you thinking of other just sort of general
I
uses
think
like
it's a question
lobbies or whatever?
I think it's a question for discussion whether
Yeah.
we're talking about hotels that are planning event space.
Right.
And,
Yeah,
and
well,
what that might look like.
Right. Yeah, that would, to me, that's the same as
Yeah,
the meeting
like
space.
a
Meeting/event space. Yeah,
Ballroom,
yeah.
conference center,
Right,
that would all
right.
fall under the,
Is that going to require a new definition in the
It might.
code
Possibly.
as
It might.
to what
Yes.
constitutes a
It
meeting
might.
room,
It might very
conference
well.
space, whatever?
Might very well.
And I think the study sounds good, but what would be the time?
well, for
About
a
a year
real
from now?
parking study, I mean, that's not quick.
Yeah.
Well, and we already know we have no parking.
Right.
We
Yeah, no,
already know we have
yeah,
a
right,
unique
right.
parking, and that doesn't require a study.
No.
Right.
no, we don't need anyone to tell us that we don't have parking.
No, the reason I would suggest the study, though, is that it'll provide very specific data to help you focus future efforts on where is the most need, how to best address it through a minimal modification. That's what a good analysis will provide you with. So
But Susan, isn't there a move afoot, a recommendation that the city have a traffic study?
Traffic study, but
And
that's different.
It
I
would
don't
sound to
think-
me like parking could be rolled into that.
And I haven't seen the RFP, so I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what they're planning there, or whether it could be rolled in. But I don't actually see that standing in the way of our taking action on this. Right.
I'm sorry, just to be clear, that you said that there is a
There
proposed
is a
traffic
There's a
study?
traffic study that's been proposed and I believe is going to be done, but I have not seen the parameters of it.
So typically, a traffic study is going to have a pretty significant difference from a parking study.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The parking study will look at every single commercial use, its location, its
Right.
proximity to residential spaces, its distance from parking.
public transportation.
It'll do a multiple time of day inventories and surveys of use and utility. In this case, I would include a seasonal element to it, and possibly a special event inclusion in that consideration too. So,
Yeah, we had one done in 2007, but it's been a while.
yeah,
Could I just make sure I understand what we sort of are moving to in the way of agreement? The approach would be a number based on rooms, consideration given to event space, meeting areas for groups of people. Did you say office space was in or out? Because I was curious about that.
Yeah, again, I thought that I had heard Matt say he already does that. And of course, the offices are
believe
likely to
so.
be small anyway.
yeah.
It's not a huge
But
amount
it
of
would be
space.
the office attached to the hotel.
Correct. Yeah.
Management.
And then, right,
Yeah.
management space. And
Right.
then nothing separate for the commercial space.
I think that's where we're headed. Yeah, yeah. I think that's where we're headed.
And just to be clear, if we're talking about meeting space, conference space, following up on what I said earlier, I would hope your recommendation would include a draft definition of what we were going to include, because I think
absolutely. Good
following
point.
up on what Jim said, we really need to see something on paper.
Absolutely.
And just, I want Luke to talk next, because even though the hotel part is, I guess, the major thing we should be looking at, there's probably a little bit of other cleanup that needs to be done if we're looking at submitting to the commissioners at once the entire commercial section. So he has some ideas about that, and I'll turn it over to him.
Well, just before I get to that, if I may, just offer some general observations as you proceed. And even though you are the Planning Commission making a recommendation to the city, I think you will be helping everybody out, yourselves, the public, and the city, if you abide by just certain principles as you consider this issue, some of which you've already alluded to, but let me just suggest that we be very clear. Again, this is more so for the Board of Commissioners, but you can help them out. A city has wide latitude to make adjustments to this specific issue, as long as there's a rational basis for the changes. If is there clearly articulated rational basis, the courts will give a city wide latitude. So I would encourage you to help the city out by spending some time thinking about articulating what is the problem, and then how does the proposed solution tie to the problem. The more that you do that, the better off the city and everybody else is. That's point one. Point two, you've already alluded to this, but I would like to underscore it, because the indicia or evidence of the problem here may be so obvious and evident, it just needs to be articulated. I don't think you need to do a study just for the sake of doing a study if the problem is obvious. I think there's much support for I do not think there's much support for the notion that in order to satisfy the rational basis test, you need to spend $50,000 on a study. That's silly. Third, and this goes to the drafting point, some of which we just experienced today. So let me just be, again, these are general observations, which I tell my law students. Sometimes it's really better just to have very simple, clear, bright line rules. Sometimes, this goes to your point, the cuter that you make, the tighter, you think you're trying to provide guidance, but by making tighter, cozier, more articulate subcategory definitions, you actually create the animal that you're trying to avoid. That is, if the rule is very clear, bright line, and general, it's clear and bright line and general. As soon as you say, well, but this means this, then by definition, this is not, B is not A. If you try to define what A is, as either being allowed or not allowed, by defining A one way or the other, you've now created the B. So sometimes, anyway, those are just general observations. What I think Susan was referring to me for was not that, however. In other contexts, in other matters, I think it's been pretty evident that the way that the Section 270-35, which is the minimum off-street parking spaces requirement, is drafted, is confusing. So just by way of example, this is 270-35. Minimum parking spaces required. Under the chart, under D, if you scroll down, I don't have this up on the screen, but the way it's which I think is the right way to do it, by the way, is it's the use, and then it's the use, and then the number of spaces. And that makes a lot of sense to me. But one situation that the city has encountered before is in identifying these two columns, there's subsection 7 and subsection 8. And subsection 7, for example, says, each retail store or service shop over 15,000 square feet of gross floor area, exclusive underground parking, that's the use. And the parking requirements for that use is as follows. 1, for each 200 square feet of floor area devoted to sales or service and exclusive of underground parking areas. Okay, I think that's, people can, whether you like it or not, I think it's pretty obvious what that's referring to is because of linking use to parking spaces. Then you go to 8. 8 says the use is all other commercial uses, and then you go to the right-hand column, which is number of spaces, and it says same as 7 above. And I think as the city's experienced, nobody knows what exactly that means, or people can argue over what that means. There's an obvious solution to that, is simply state in the right-hand column what you mean. If you mean the same as the number of requirements under 7, just restate what you have under 7, or pick another number. But to simply say same as above is not a good drafting example.
That was the clear space issue as
Yes.
well.
So you're proposing to just repeat above rather than saying same as above?
Yes,
Right, okay.
even if it's just restating verbatim,
right.
restate verbatim. That removes any ambiguity.
And wouldn't that be also the case with 5 here, which is same as 4 above?
Yes, the same thing for 5, which is medical, dental, and legal offices over 10,000 square feet in size. It says same as 4 above. If you mean that, then just restate it. Your code's long already. You're not going to really add a whole lot by adding 2 more lines. That's just a drafting suggestion.
I agree with that. So, Chair, what would you like to do? We have a
Well-
path forward?
I'd like for you to have a proposal to us by next week, and we could meet and act on it.
I'll leave it all in Nick's hands. Yeah, I don't think, I think we can easily have something, for the next meeting and to send out ahead of time, and hopefully more than 2 days ahead of time to you.
Very good.
Absolutely. Yeah, my goal will be to have a draft proposal submitted to Susan for her discussion here by midweek. Again, once we have an opportunity to get through the materials, wrap our head around things. Yeah, this shouldn't be rocket science. Let's keep it simple.
Anybody else have any thoughts, comments? That would be great, if you would, please.
Absolutely.
The problem is significant.
Yeah, absolutely. And time is of the,
Yeah, absolutely.
can't talk. Time is of the essence.
Yes. Anything else on this topic?
No, good for me.
Good discussion. Thank you, Susan.
Thanks. I learned a lot from it. It's great.
All right, well, then moving on, Matt isn't here for a building inspector's report and has told us about what is coming from the next hotel.
And is that expected to be on our February meeting for concept?
We haven't talked about, we
Okay.
haven't looked at
Haven't looked
what's
at.
coming.
Okay, that's fine.
What hotel is it? I missed it.
This is the one on Baltimore.
Atlantic Crown.
Atlantic
Crown.
Langford.
Langford, correct.
Okay.
Mr. Mehta, can you update us on where is 330 Rehoboth? That could be another hotel in the pipeline, depending on the litigation outcome.
So remember, 330 Rehoboth was a matter where the Board of Commissioners had referred a matter of a rezoning request to the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission made its referral, recommendation back to the Board of Commissioners, which adopted the recommendation, which prompted a lawsuit. That lawsuit was initially filed in Chancery Court, which is a court of equity in Delaware. The Chancery Court says, I don't see any equitable claim here, so I don't want to consider it. So in theory, it's been referred over to Superior Court, which is not a court of equity. And it really hasn't progressed much. It is sort of sitting in Superior Court because the procedural context by which it has landed in Superior Court is a little bit unusual, and I'm not sure the parties or the court know exactly how to proceed.
Well, that's,
So it'll be a while.
okay.
Is there a pending motion?
I don't believe so. I don't believe, I think that right now there, the question is there a status conference to decide how to proceed. And a status conference has been requested in the last update I received, that has not occurred yet.
Is it a petition, is it a cert case, or is it a?
That I think that is one of the issues,
Okay.
since
So it's not a
normally you would get
statutory
from the
appeal.
city to the Superior Court through a writ of certiorari.
Right.
Here, it was a lawsuit filed in Chancery Court, and the Chancery Court says, I don't have jurisdiction, and I think that's part of the procedural conundrum.
Well, what's interesting is that courts of law often apply equitable principles, so it's, I mean, at least in Virginia. Okay, is that it?
Yeah, and I'm sure, as you may have heard through others or in the local paper, it sounds like the Beach Walk matter now has finally exhausted any last gasp efforts to get the Supreme Court to look at it from a different angle.
Well, I think that finishes our agenda,
How about that?
and unless someone objects, we're adjourned.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
4:30
Thank you.
today, that's great. I thought the city had filed a motion.